Minutes
Thank you.
from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it astonishing that the chairman would tout the so-called American Rescue Plan as a success. Even Democratic consultants like Steve Ratner and Larry Summers were warning that it was so irresponsible that it would trigger a crippling inflation. Mr. Chairman, it turns out all the free checks you sent out were actually very expensive, and Americans are paying them back every day at the grocery store, the gas station, the tax collector, everywhere they spend money. I've seen a report costing average families about $5,000 from their purchasing power. My God, but before the lockdowns took a wrecking ball to the economy, we had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, the lowest poverty rate in 60 years, the fastest wage growth in 40 years, and it was working class families gaining the most. The gap between rich and poor was actually narrowing for the first time in our lifetimes. We were energy independent for the first time in our lifetimes. Inflation was around 1%. Interest rates were near all-time lows. That didn't happen by accident. The Republican tax cuts produced one of the biggest economic expansions in history, an expansion that was so great, we ended up taking in more revenues after the tax cuts than we'd received before them. We saw the biggest regulatory rollback in history that freed up American energy resources, brought companies back to America from overseas. But all you had to do was continue those policies that produced this prosperity. And instead you did the opposite. You spent trillions of dollars we didn't have. You started what Mr. Biden just called an incredible transition away from fossil fuels by imposing the highest gasoline prices in American history. You've admitted into our country an impoverished population the size of West Virginia that American taxpayers have to now support. And you have the audacity to try to tell us that the economy's doing great. Just a word of advice, you can't spin the economy. Every person knows how the economy is doing because they're living it every day. And that's what makes the old Reagan question so devastating to you and your party. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Everybody knows the answer to that in their own lives. And they can see clearly who's responsible for it. You're not fooling anyone. Now, Mr. Swagel, I want to begin with three numbers that describe the fiscal reality we face: 28, 76, and 89. According to our calculations, 28% is the growth in population and inflation combined over the last 10 years. 28%. 76% is the growth in revenues, which means that revenues are growing at nearly 3 times the rate of inflation and population over the past 10 years. That's after the tax cuts. 89% is the increase in spending, and spending is the fine point of the matter. Seems to me there are only 3 ways to pay for it. Taxes, but personal taxes decrease the purchasing power of families in the present. Business taxes are passed through to consumers as higher prices, to employees as lower wages, and to investors as lower earnings. So that's one way you can do it. Second way is to borrow from capital markets, but of course this reduces the capital available to finance construction and consumer spending and home and automobile purchases and business expansion. And of course, borrowing is paid back through future taxes, and it generates additional interest costs along the way. And the third way is to borrow from ourselves, essentially printing money, which is the direct cause of inflation: too many dollars chasing too few goods. So it follows then that it's excessive spending that is driving all 3 drags on the economy. To paraphrase the Clinton era maxim, it's the spending stupid. Mr. Swagel, am I missing anything?
No. I mean, I think you've got it. That right. The inflation we're seeing is the combination of very strong demand and much of that is driven by by fiscal policy. Certainly, there's a recovery from the pandemic combined with the supply constraints, and those are driving inflation.
Well, let's talk about that inflation rate for a second. 8.3%, as I understand it. So does that mean if I managed to put away $100,000 in my retirement fund, does that mean I've just lost $8,300 in purchasing power over the last year?
Or that would be one implication that the number you gave is the most recent 12 months of inflation. It means that Americans nominal wages are up, but real wages are down for most Americans. So it's a challenge for families. a challenge for the economy. Absolutely. And a fiscal challenge as well.
And isn't the classic definition of inflation too many dollars chasing too few goods? So if you flood the economy with dollars while you raise taxes on productivity, you get more inflation or less inflation?
Right. I mean, we have very strong demand and serious constraints on supply, and those dollars chasing the inadequate supply that leads to higher inflation.
Right. Thank you.